We're experiencing something that I've been discussing for years now, a general 21st century shaping struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And if US democracy breaks, then there's no real prospect for democracy around the world.
Welcome to The Stakes. I'm Brad Rourke with the Charles F. Kettering Foundation. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan operating foundation that focuses on advancing and defending inclusive democracy. Today I'm talking to Kettering Senior Fellow Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Brad. Always happy to be on with you.
Fantastic to have you. There's a lot to talk about, including a new book, but we'll get to that. First, there's a lot happening around the globe. Ceasefire in Israel-Palestine, Assad's regime in Syria has fallen. In Georgia, Tbilisi saw demonstrations as the government suspended EU talks. Romania, the court has called for a restart of elections after what looked like foreign interference, resulting in the far-right candidate having won. Could you draw a line between all of these things from a pro-democracy standpoint? What do you make of what's happening?
I'd say that we're experiencing something that I've been discussing for years now, a general 21st century shaping struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. And we could point to specific authoritarian regimes or specific democracies that are under fire, or we could just understand that we're in one of these kind of pivotal moments where we had a 20th century, maybe as early as the 19th century, some trend lines towards democracy, carving out some space against monarchies and authoritarian regimes. And now we see basically a reversal for a couple of different reasons, I think. One is that democracy thrives on the ability to service the interests of the populations. And there seems to be a moment where the populations feel like they're being left behind, that democracy is not responsive, that elections by themselves are insufficient to keep folks engaged. We had, in the context of our recent election, 100 million eligible voters didn't participate. So I think those types of conditions, and the fact that there's a seeming prosperity associated with some of these authoritarian regimes, and that we have these new tools that allow the authoritarians and the illiberal components of our own systems, our own societies, to be able to manipulate the population, disinformation, misinformation. We're in this really, really kind of oppressive moment where we see reversals in the U.S., seemingly with the election of a Donald Trump administration that has some tendencies to subvert and run around the rule of law as the executive branch responsible for fulfilling the laws. And we see the same trend lines in other portions of the world. You pointed to Romania that canceled its elections. It wasn't just because a far-right candidate won. It's because there was a huge amount of evidence that the election was co-opted and the far-right won because of disinformation. And then you have Hungary, Slovakia, Turkey in the European plane. India is on the fence as to whether it wants to continue to be a democracy. It's by population, it's the largest country in the world, but also the largest democracy. The U.S., I mean, we are seeing some really negative indicators really throughout the globe. So that's the struggle that we're facing.
It's gripping. You were director of European affairs for the National Security Council under President Trump's first term, U.S. attaché to Moscow and Kyiv. Your expertise in Russia, Ukraine, and NATO is undisputed, really, and that's top of the news right now. Bring us up to date there. What is happening with the Russian-Ukraine conflict?
So the narrative is that Russia is winning, that it's just a matter of time before Ukraine capitulates. The reality is different. The reality is that both Russia and Ukraine are under enormous pressure. Ukraine, because it's a smaller country, Russia has 3.5 times the population, has an economy that's 10 times the size of Ukraine's. But what we're really witnessing is Ukraine effectively defending, even though it's losing territory, it's losing personnel, and imposing massive costs on Russia. That's on the battlefield. And then the democracies of the world, led by the US, imposing severe economic costs on Russia to the point where Russia's economy is teetering, and 2025 may be the year where it goes off the cliff. And we are in a particularly delicate situation where the Trump administration can follow the line of a Russia first strategy, or something consistent with the way actually 6 different administrations from the collapse of the Soviet Union looked at making sure that Russia remained intact, remained stable because of the threat of a nuclear Armageddon, or Trump administration that may take us down America first, not in the way that it's kind of captured in the news media at the moment, which is basically isolationism, but one that puts America's U.S. national security interests in a central position, which in my view means that we provide more fulsome support to Ukraine, more fulsome military aid to Ukraine, to pressure Russia to negotiate to end this most pressing international crisis and end the instability that we're facing and the threat of massive war spilling over into Europe. That would be in America's interest. Europe is the U.S.'s most important trading partner. Anything that we could aid with regard to stability is in U.S. interest. So that kind of America first approach would be very healthy.
You talked about rule of law earlier, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine is clearly against a rules-based world order where borders are respected. What are the prospects for a rules-based world order remaining?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It really looks quite fragile at the moment. I don't think that the UN holds much credibility. I don't think that the kind of norms around the use of military aggression are holding. They're certainly have eroded after Russia's aggression. It is quite precarious. I guess the question is, can we focus on some kinds of fundamentals rather than specific institutions? Can we focus on the idea that democracy still serves the interests of populations? And this is something that I'm going to probably struggle with for the foreseeable future, because with the Trump election, we end up in a situation where if the U.S. democracy erodes, if U.S. democracy breaks, then there's really no real prospect for democracy around the world. You still have some areas of integrity in Europe, but the U.S. is really the backbone. So I think whether we can hold our institutions together, that's not just the executive branch is going to be run by somebody that has, at best, ambiguous, likely illiberal views. Evidence suggests that it's the latter. And the question is, does the judiciary hold? Does the military abide by its oath to the Constitution? Do the states in our federal system check the excesses of a federal power? I think that's probably the case. Before we started, you mentioned Stephen Levitsky, who's written on this topic. He would argue that that's the likely scenario, although we leave these next 4 years bruised and battered. I think I fall in that same kind of line, but it looks pretty iffy and touch and go.
When you served in the government, you yourself came under immense pressure in the previous Trump administration for your role in the controversy around the Ukraine call. And moving forward, what is the role of courage for individuals serving America?
I think it's absolutely essential. For me, I didn't have to kind of really mull over my decisions. I knew what the right thing to do was. I had been raised in my military service to not walk by some wrongdoing, and it didn't really make a difference where that emanated from. I was going to do my job. I think we'll have plenty of folks emerge as heroes in this next 4 years. I mean, we've already seen some instances of a bishop in a prayer breakfast trying to speak to Donald Trump's better angels about the potential abuses against undocumented and the most vulnerable. So I think we're going to see plenty of evidence of that. The question is, how much repression does the Trump administration undertake? In its early days, they don't have a team in place yet to be able to implement those kinds of repressive policies, but they will soon enough, and we'll see which way they go.
You've got a new book coming out very soon. It's entitled The Folly of Realism, How the West Deceived Itself About Russia and Betrayed Ukraine. What are you telling us in that book?
This was my doctoral dissertation, and I thought that the topic was important to rewrite for the general audience. The book comes out on February 25th, the day after the third year anniversary, about a month into the second Trump term. And the subject matter is taking a look at the mistakes and some of the successes that were made over the course of 6 administrations from George H.W. Bush forward since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Mainly, it was mistakes that resulted in this massive geopolitical earthquake that is the Russia-Ukraine war. And those mistakes emanated from a place of putting Russia first, succumbing to our hopes that we could accomplish more with Russia than we could, and fears that if we held Russia to account, that it would devolve the relationship into another Cold War. We ended up there anyway. So what I counsel, in addition to diagnosing these stumbles and follies driven by this really short-term transactional approach that is represented by realism, is a long-term view driven by something called neo-idealism, this notion that values are central to our interests and could help us navigate around short-termism, around the shiny object immediately in front of us, and focus on what really matters long-term, like stability of our alliance structure, institution building, pro-democracy efforts on rule of law, on things like freedom of navigation, a kind of free trade that also recognizes that we have to protect our own long-term economic well-being, a level of pragmatism that's involved in this idea of neo-idealism, where it's not just sacrificing our interests to values, but balancing between values and interests and what we could practically accomplish. So I tackle quite a bit of subject matter in it, and I'm looking forward to discussing it with the public at large.
Neo-idealism, you're bringing it forward as a foreign policy principle, but it sounds like it could be a domestic policy principle too.
It is. I think so. I think the trick is having the practitioners that could parse through, what fights are necessary to fight, what could be accomplished, while always keeping values front and center. And the times that we have to be maybe, I don't want to use the word sacrifice, but the times we have to be maybe a little bit more flexible is in conditions of extreme vital interest, and we have really no choice but to take somewhat more kind of ambiguous approaches. But I think that always keeping values front and center and being conscious of where we need to bend is a good framing.
Kettering Senior Fellow, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me.